This poster is based on part of my PhD project, which looks at representation of women in street art and murals in Belfast and Bogota. And so I do both a visual analysis of these murals, but I also conduct interviews with women, artists, activists, political representatives, even though I haven't been able to interview them yet, but to sort of see how they perceive these murals, how they interpret this representation, if there is representation. And so through this research, I've sort of identified two kinds of murals in Belfast. The first one, which I've dubbed traditional murals, even though they date back to the 1980s, so they're not like they're not that old, but they mostly refer to the conflict, or they're painted in a very specific style, so it's very realistic, a lot of acrylic paint, they take up the whole wall, kind of thing. Yes, exactly. And so they usually reference both like community-wide culture, so either nationalist Republican culture or unionist loyalist culture, but they also have hyper-local references. So in this one, for example, it's taken in Ballymurphy, that's a neighborhood of West Belfast, and these people literally live on the street where the mural is painted. Well, they lived, because it's a memorial. And so in these murals, I've sort of looked at the representation of women, and most of the murals that represent women represent them as part of the community, part of the family, or as mythical figures that are figures of support, like Mother Island, for example. And so I haven't had the time yet to look at unionist loyalist murals, so I can't really speak to that, even though I know they're not really represented in those, like at all. But if you look at nationalist Republican murals, or murals identified as such, there's also a representation of women as activists and combatants, especially with like really big figures like Countess Markovich from the 1916 revolution, or Mary Farrell, who was killed in Gibraltar in '88. So these figures kind of show up, but here, for example, you have a very local combatant. She's a woman and she's on the mural. And then the other kind of murals and street art you can find in Belfast is, well, they don't call themselves mural artists, they call themselves street artists, because they want to sort of distinguish between them and more traditional muralists. And so for the past 10, 15 years, there's been sort of a new form of mural art in Belfast, which takes its root in like global graffiti, global street art, like this one and this one. And those are found in the city center, and they're also part of like a public political decision to change the identity of the city. Like it even went so far that at Eurovision 2 weeks ago, they chose two images of newer street art to represent Belfast in one of the small postcards. So that's how far this has gone. And so these murals are very different from traditional murals. They're neutral, they're not related to conflict, they have a very different style as well. They're almost all in the city center, but the way they represent women, so they represent women a bit more, but the way they represent women isn't necessarily all that different. There's still a majority of them that show them as community, family, even mythical figures, but there's also sort of what I've dubbed presence of women. So like this one, for example, where there's a woman on the wall, she's there, but she doesn't have any specific role, she's just there being pretty, basically. And there's also, like in Republican nationalist murals, although in a different way, there's also women as activists, women as artists that you can see on the wall, you can see in this last one. And so in interviews with activists and artists in Belfast, I've generally found that traditional murals are rejected. I've spoken mostly to women from a younger generation who saw these murals growing up and found them very violent and scared. Most of them have guns on them, so it's kind of for them related to trauma of the war. And so they, in general, quite like these newer murals. They find joy in them. One interview participant even told me that she was really excited because her daughter was very excited when she saw a woman smiling on the wall. And at the same time, they say that while this is better than the ones with the guns, it's still not really a representation of real women.
Is a reaction to like dogs?
It's not so much of a reaction as much as it sort of developed after and from different roots as well. Like I said, this is a younger generation, so they were maybe like the oldest of the painters in the city center would have been maybe 15 or 20 when the Good Friday Agreement was signed. So I think it's also sort of like the peace generation, as it's been dubbed, even though that's slightly problematic, but sort of like that. And so this presence is, they find it nice, but also they would like to see angry women. They would like to see real women. They would like to see women demanding things. And that's also appeared mostly because there are a lot of women who paint and who paint themselves in Belfast. During the Hit the North Festival, which is in May every year, about 50% of the painters are women. And so that's also changing the way women are represented, and they get to show themselves naked, and they get to show themselves with stretch marks and with hair in their armpits and stuff like that. And so that's sort of changing a bit the way women are shown in public space, even though they're still overwhelmingly shown in sort of when they are shown in this sort of supportive or pretty presence kind of way.